Hello and welcome to Dateline London. Greece, Brexit and the future of the euro, plus ISIS and its fellow travellers. My guests today are Stryker Maguire of Bloomberg Markets, Maria Margaronis of The Nation, Nabila Ramdani, who's a French-Algerian journalist, and Polly Toynbee of The Guardian. Very good to see you. Well, that tired old metaphor used about the euro crisis was kicking the can down the road and never reaching a conclusion about what to do. But have we reached the end of the road as far as Greece is concerned, especially since Greek savers have begun to panic about their money in the banks? 5 billion, according to the FT, have been taken out in a week. How do you see the situation now? Because there is supposed to be a final deadline now.
Well, yes, the final deadline really comes when there is no more money in the Greek banks. And one of the interesting things that's happening is that the ECB is continuing to increase liquidity assistance to the Greek banks. So the ECB seems to have decided it's not going to make the decision on its own. There's a lot of hysteria being generated. Some of it is coming in the form of leaks from from Eurozone meetings, people coming out and saying, oh, European commissioners are saying the banks might not open on Monday. The governor of the Bank of Greece himself, who was a finance minister in a former government, issuing dire warnings about if we don't have a deal soon, Greece may leave the Eurozone and even the European Union. This is all extremely unhelpful, and I think, given that, people in Greece have been surprisingly calm. A lot of money has left Greek banks, but there aren't vast queues at cash machines. Having said that, people's nerves are completely shattered. People walk past the newsstands like this, not to look at the headlines. People turn off the television. I think we need to a little bit take the focus off these immediate negotiations. My gut feeling is that there will be another kicking of the can down the road, because nobody is ready for the cataclysm that will follow if Greece defaults, which may or may not then lead to an exit from the Eurozone, which may or may not then lead to an exit from the European Union. Nobody knows what happens in that case. But we really have to come to some sort of solution that isn't just kicking the can down the road, because this can't go on indefinitely. Greece needs debt relief, which the IMF knows. One of the reasons why the IMF walked out of the talks last week was not just because of frustration with the Greeks, but because of frustration with the Eurozone partners who won't countenance debt relief.
Although Christine Lagarde said, basically, we've got to talk to adults, grown-ups.
She said that afterwards.
Was very cross.
She did. She's very cross with Varoufakis, but Olivier Blanchard has also wrote a blog post saying, basically, we have to think about debt relief. And the Eurozone partners won't even think about that at this point, because it won't go down well with their electorates. But Greek debt is totally unsustainable. Everybody knows it. The IMF has acknowledged, and getting worse, because the deeper the country sinks into depression, the worse it gets. So something has to be done. Debt relief, investment, real reform. Everybody knows this.
The markets know it as well. They've kind of priced this in.
Already, yeah. Like last week, you would have expected the markets everywhere to be moving up and down, backwards and forwards, but it was only happening in Europe. It wasn't happening elsewhere because people have it's been discounted, number one, and they've discounted both a Grexit and not a Grexit. I mean, they're basically saying, forget it. However, what is very different, I think, is that in capitals around the world, like Washington, they are paying a lot of attention to this, because there's a huge geopolitical dimension to this. Yeah. All you have to do is something very old-fashioned, and that is just look at a map and look at where Greece is, and then look at where North Africa is, look at where Russia is, look at Turkey, which itself, like Greece, a NATO member, Turkey is kind of changing its attitudes toward the West, whatever that means these days. Then you have Syria, Iraq on Turkey's borders.
And the refugees who are moving in, which are a sort of human
absolutely
a sign of exactly that geopolitical stress that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But I mean, so many people have said the common sense thing is for there to be a deal, except nobody can quite figure out what that deal in common sense would be.
Well, it's going to involve it is going to involve some debt forgiveness of some kind. It has to happen, because they can't possibly pay, and there already has been quite a bit of that. I mean, 250 billion roughly in bailouts
in 2012.
Yes, but still, that's a lot of money. And it's what the NHS budget is 90 billion.
It is.
So it's a lot of money. But I think there will have to be solutions that make it look. This is where it gets tricky, because what Merkel wants to do something, but she has to do something that's also curries favor with her own electorate.
Yeah.
And so she has that problem. Tsipras has a similar problem. He goes one way or the other. If he performs badly, he's out at some point.
We've always heard that the euro is a political project, which has an economic dimension. So there has to be a political solution, which means Merkel effectively deciding what that is, and others.
Well, I think more fundamentally, the golden rule of EU membership is that membership is conditional, and Greece has been told that time and time again, and it hasn't satisfied the economic standards for that membership, and yet we have another elected Greek government resisting rule makers, and I think we are as close as the end of the road as we can get. And it's not just the Greeks who should be panicking, it's actually all the countries involved in the monetary union. And of course, the Greeks could strike a deal with its creditors, they can get fresh aid and avoid a default. But my betting is that we'll be exactly back in the same position very soon afterwards. We've heard the Greek Prime Minister saying that he wants to stay in the euro, but the reality is that bank withdrawals are creating massive pressures, and in countries like Germany, the fear is that providing new loans for Greece without extracting some sort of more spending cuts effectively would represent more transfer union, to use a jargon, effectively wealthier nations providing handouts to weaker nations like Greece.
With the political problems that we were just talking about a moment ago, well, for exactly. Merkel and others.
And to put it in dramatic terms, it would mean weaker nations like Greece effectively blackmailing other members into a transfer union without controls or indeed regulations. And that's the reason why...
I can hear a lot of silence. I can't see it in a minute, Polly, but I think I have to go to the...
But if you look at what's happened to the Greek economy and the German economy comparatively, during this currency union, you will see that in fact the Greek economy has gone down the tubes and the German economy is continuing to grow. So, it's not just a question of the stronger nations helping out the weaker nations. It's a question of a system that doesn't work for the weaker nations because they cannot compete in this framework.
The design fault at the heart of the euro, some people
Absolutely. What Merkel needs to say to her own country is the extraordinary amounts of money that they've made out of the eurozone, that they, by being the strong currency, have actually sucked money out of the weaker countries. They have been able to trade and export greatly to their advantage and to the disadvantage of the weaker countries. I mean, that's where their growth has come from. So the question facing Europe now is, does it really believe in itself or not? I mean, Greece was a pivotal point. Everybody knew it was weak when it joined, but looking back at its quite recent history of dictatorship, pulling Greece into permanently the civilized group of nations within the EU, guaranteeing that they would stay a democracy. These are very important things. We're in the middle of a time of, for some reason, massive celebrations of ends of war, whether it was Waterloo, First World War, Second World War. It's only 70 years since Europe was fighting itself. That's a very short time in terms of the history of Europe. And I think people have to understand how Europe falling apart would be really dangerous. The idea that we could never be back at 1914 just isn't true.
Well, we could
very easily be.
But also, it's not that long since Greece was a dictatorship, a military dictatorship.
No, it's not. The dictatorship fell in 1974, and joining the EU and then the Eurozone was very much, as Polly says, a symbol of the end of that terrible time. But and before that, the Greek Civil War, which was the beginning of the Cold War, ended in 1949 and was followed by 30 years of very, very powerful political repression. And one of the things that's most worrying to me is watching how through this crisis, polarization in Greece has grown and grown. It's always been a polarized society. The gap between rich and poor has grown during the crisis. Last week, there were 2 demonstrations on Syntagma Square. One was an anti-austerity pro-Syriza demonstration, and the other one the next day was a demonstration called We Want to Stay in Europe. And that was something that began on Facebook but was quickly taken up and used by the opposition parties who are doing their utmost to undermine the Syriza government. This is a very dangerous situation for Greece.
But I think, going forward, I think it's like having a club with a long-standing member who flouts the rules. And the club has an alternative. It can relax its rules or throw out the member.
But if it throws out the member, it will be the beginning of the end for Europe.
Well, actually,
the markets and everyone else will then
necessarily
they will look at
disaster
Italy.
for Greece to go it alone.
They'll look at weaker countries. Well, in the process of going it alone, it will go through a time of such terrible deprivation. It's very likely Syriza will be gone. It's quite likely that you'll see the rise of a neo-fascist movement.
And many Europeans are inclined towards the second option.
But I think there is, you know, Nabila, you mentioned the rules, and but I don't think it's either or. I mean, I think actually Greece has changed, and probably there will be permanent structural changes in Greece. I mean, Greece was, the management of the economy was appalling. It must have been embarrassing to Greeks everywhere. The fact that from 2000 to 2007, it was one of the largest, fastest growing economies in Europe, and every single year they ran a government deficit. And there's just no excuse for that. And I think a lot of those problems, they will change. They will begin to collect taxes more efficiently.
This is what ought to happen. You know, this is what really ought to have happened from the time there was a change of government. And Syriza said, we want to sort out corruption. Varoufakis is still saying it. We want to sort out clientelism. They haven't done nearly enough. They've admitted this. They really need to get a grip on this. And this is where the Europeans could have helped. You cannot make those changes with a gun to your head.
Can I ask you a final point? Is it Vladimir Putin to the rescue? I mean, what is going on with Greece and Russia?
God help us all. Look, this is very complicated. Greece and Russia have a very old relationship. You know, co-religionists, Orthodox faith. The Greek left has always sort of looked towards Russia. Even now, there's a sort of romantic connection to Russia. There are real connections there. Tsipras is partly playing a diplomatic game, saying, look, Europeans, if you don't, you know, if you continue like this, I do have friends elsewhere. Russia has no money to give to Greece. They've apparently just signed a deal for a gas pipeline, although I haven't seen any concrete evidence of this. And when I heard Putin on the radio, thing on the radio this morning saying Putin has asked the Europeans to be nice to Greece, I just thought, please, we don't need friends like these. We really don't.
Yes, but it's quite clever because Europe should really think about that.
Well, yes.
It might well be the only alternative left for Greece if Greece is thrown out. And, you know, this is a serious matter, as you're saying.
This is where Stryker's point is so important.
Geopolitics.
The geopolitics are absolutely crucial here.
Let's move on, because in the days of the great ideological struggle between communism and capitalism, those on the left who were broadly sympathetic to the aims of the Soviet Union were often described as fellow travellers. Well, this week, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, warned against those within some Muslim communities who, in his words, quietly condone the ideology of so-called Islamic State. Is he right to raise concerns about ISIS fellow travellers in Britain and elsewhere? What did you think of his speech?
Well, I must say that I found the Prime Minister's use of the words quietly condoning particularly insidious, because it conjured up the image of thousands of otherwise peaceful and indeed well-integrated Muslims gently nodding in agreement, if you like, as they contemplate the next IS decapitation or burning. If you suggested for a moment that thousands of Americans were quietly condoning the racism and the hatred of humanity which prompts white American shooters to regularly murder their fellow citizens, there would be an outcry. And yet, because a tiny minority of misguided individuals travel to join IS, we suddenly have to imagine that numerous European Muslims support them. It couldn't be further from the truth, and it's deeply offensive. Yes, David Cameron has the legal authority to prevent people from joining groups like IS or any other terrorist organization for that matter. That's his job. But he is using and indeed manipulating his legal authority to stigmatize a community. And there I say he's falling into the classic trap of speaking in terms of generic groups rather than concentrating on a tiny minority of criminally minded radicals. And, you know, this is not a courageous dialogue, as he put it. It's, how to put it, it's, it's scaremongering of the highest order. And all it does is stir up hatred and indeed mistrust.
What did you make of it? Because leaving aside just for a second the Prime Minister's actual remarks and whether he should have said it slightly differently, there is a fear, a worry in this country that there are some people who are effectively ideologues who don't quite dirty their hands in violence. So there's not very many of them, but that nothing can really be done about these people because they stir up hate but don't directly get involved in any criminal offences?
I think it's rather like at the time of Irish terrorism, that there was a sort of general smear against anybody Irish. Oh, they may be fellow travellers. But there was certainly a small part of the Irish community that was sympathetic, and there was the American Irish community that was actually funding the IRA from afar, where they weren't suffering. So there always are gradations of levels of sympathy and an inner core. I mean, there's no doubt that when you see very, very extreme religious practice, very disciplinarian attitudes, strong attitudes to repressing women in certain parts of that community, you are afraid that this breeds an idea that actually, it may not exactly support the Islamic State, and of course it's much more complicated depending who's Sunni, who's Shia, and so on. But nevertheless, you do have an instinctive sense that it's not a good idea, that madrasas are not a good idea, that the idea of Islamic schools in this country, often quite extreme, are a really bad idea. And the idea that the state is allowing free schools to be set up, Islamic or any religious free schools. I mean, I'm a humanist, I'm an atheist, and I'm a vice president of the British Humanist Association, so I would say this wouldn't I? But I do think any state encouragement for religious separatism or any religions is absolutely toxic.
But given that your views, you would take issue with, for example, a minority of clergy within the Church of England who say certain things about homosexuality,
Absolutely.
which you don't like.
Absolutely.
But
there are
that's
actually
part of our.
people.
That's part. So why some Muslim clergy or other people shouldn't have some arguments about homosexuality or other things? That's just part of diversity in Britain, isn't it? It's got nothing to do with Islam. It's got to do with how different people feel.
It is indeed, but I think that when you look at the radicalisation of some of these young people, it is mostly for social reasons. They are disaffected, they are left behind, they feel either oppressed by rather a strict background when they're caught between two cultures. All of that is very difficult and not necessarily the fault of any particular mosque or group of people. But there is no doubt that there are strands of very extreme beliefs which I think it's right for the state to be afraid of and to be keeping an eye on.
I just wondered whether this is one of those rare occasions, again, leaving aside the precise words of the Prime Minister, that you look at what any government can do about this problem, and actually all governments are slightly flailing around. Do you have, with people who haven't committed offences, do you restrict their behaviour in some way? Is that against their civil liberties? We've had a case of somebody who's been tagged. The tag is being removed this weekend. It is very difficult for any government to know quite what to do here.
I think, on the one hand, you have to be realistic about, for example, there will be people who will go and fight for causes, and causes that we agree with, causes that we disagree with. And really, there's only so much you can do about that. Just as there have been people go to fight with ISIS, there are other people from this country and from the United States who have gone to fight against ISIS.
With Kurdish forces, for example.
Exactly. And there's only so much that you can do with that. What you don't want to be is hysterical, and you certainly don't want to be a politician stirring up hysteria. I mean, then you get into a situation, as in the United States after Pearl Harbor, where the vast majority of all Japanese Americans were interned. They were in camps.
And they were loyal Americans.
Of course. But the thing is that once this can spin out of control rather easily, especially with the internet that we're blaming it on, and the internet that is also a kind of a medium of free speech. I mean, the fact is that hysteria can grow very quickly, I think.
You're right, and that's why what the Prime Minister says, well, what we say doesn't really matter very much. What the Prime Minister says really matters, and he should have been much more careful. This was a generalised smear of a kind that really is dangerous and will alienate a whole lot of the Muslim community, themselves struggling hard to stop their children being radicalised.
But plus he undermined the work of the many, many Muslims in this country who are trying very hard to prevent this kind of radicalisation. And then making this speech in Slovakia rather than in Britain, I thought was a very odd move. It's as if it puts him outside this country, and it's as if he's almost afraid to say these things here. Why would he do it in Slovakia?
Could we try and be a bit more positive and see if you've got some thoughts about how the majority of Muslims should deal with this problem of radicalisation, which is affecting their community more than anybody else? Because I was talking to a man the other day who pointed out more Muslims have been killed by other Muslims because of these ideas than any other religion. So it's also a Muslim problem.
Well, and more specifically so. And Polly was hinting at, social problems and deprivation as the root causes of radicalisation. But it may well be that a lot of Muslims also object to the wars which have reduced countries like Iraq and Afghanistan to hotbeds of radicalism. Extrajudicial killings have gone on for years on all sides. But the military power of countries such as America makes sure that they're far better at it than their enemies. And there's absolutely no doubt that the intense violence used by America to export its brand of freedom ideology has helped around the world, has helped to radicalize people in war-torn countries. And that doesn't mean that Muslims support groups like ISIS, quite the opposite. And dare I say, the height of hypocrisy from David Cameron's comes when he supports countries, he defends countries like Saudi Arabia, which seems to outperform groups like IS in its cruelty and its savagery.
Well, not only that, it founded a lot of these and financed a lot of these revolutionary Islamic movements.
More than 100 beheadings have been recorded in Saudi Arabia so far, and it's well on the way to outdo its record of last year. And yet we have the British government quietly condoning a country like Saudi Arabia.
Do you see that tied up with another geostrategic question about how to deal with various regimes in the Middle East, including Egypt, including
Well,
Saudi
I mean,
Arabia?
I think so. Excuse me. There has been some talk in recent years that because the United States is becoming less dependent on the Saudis, for example, for oil, that maybe the relationship with Saudi Arabia could change. There certainly doesn't seem to be too much sign of that.
Well,
but
there's a multi-billion-dollar deal at stake as far as trade arms is concerned between Saudi Arabia and the UK. So.
Yeah, I know exactly.
But, just to pursue try to pursue the more positive point. I mean, as you know, in this country, one of the big stories this week has been these 3 women with their children, 12 people in total who we believe have now gone to Syria to join Islamic State. And we were told by a friend and neighbour of one of the women that she just felt completely out of sympathy with the British way of life. Now, if that's true, you can't stop people from leaving a country that they don't want to be part of and don't feel part of, can you? Which is, not a slur on the majority of Muslim people who want to be here, but it is very, very peculiar to most of us that somebody would choose ISIS over living in this country.
Well, I think we have to remember that we're talking about a tiny minority of people, and those figures which keep being bandied around, I would contend that there's a tiny minority of people who make that choice. This idea that, young women would, there are hundreds of young women who would leave stable, safe homes, good families to choose a life of abject horror and indeed discomfort is absolutely ludicrous. But I think the British are very good at making people feel at home. And indeed Muslim communities take this danger of radicalisation extremely seriously. There was a very good comment piece by Baroness Warsi about the efforts put forward by the Muslim communities, either in community centres or mosques or any space, public space actually, to speak to young people and to make them realise that this is home.
But that suggests a more positive, again, way of looking at it, which is that Muslim leaders in various communities seem to be doing their bit. The question is how to help them and how to help them get through to the people that they find most difficult to get through to, which may be 2nd or 3rd generation people who don't really feel part of any culture.
I think it's been very difficult for governments, whether this one or the previous Labour government, to understand, because, these are white, non-Muslim governments who have very little understanding, as I don't either, of the various different movements within the Muslim community. And I think it's quite hard to get it right as a government. On the one hand, you don't want to support people who turn out to be importing rather fiery clerics from outside, or people who are totally irrelevant to the young people who need to be approached. I mean, supporting the right kind of movements and picking winners, as it were, within the Muslim community to support is difficult. I think they were probably wrong to sack Baroness Warsi, who seems to be quite well plugged in and have a pretty good idea of who should be backed. And I think it was because she's difficult. Cameron got rid of her, and he finds women difficult anyway.
I think you're moving off into a completely different subject, which will get us in even more trouble. But in just about 30 seconds, the final thing is that the government is obviously thinking of more legislation in this area. It's going to be a huge difficulty, isn't it? Because there are all kinds of civil liberties groups who can see the problems of so-called thought crimes.
Well, and it has a tiny majority. I think it's going to be very difficult, and yet, you know, as we all discuss this, it's clear that we understand that something has to be done, but it really has to be done intelligently, and it has to be done in a balanced way. And what it can't do is become hysterical.
OK, thanks very much. Thank you all. That's it for Dateline London for this week. You can comment on the programme on Twitter @Gavin Esler. We're back next week at the same time. Please make a date with Dateline. Goodbye.